saying that he'll be out within 5 minutes. Apparently the delay has been while his family and some of his supporters, who flew down from Johannesburg in 2 chartered jets this morning, arrived at the prison only minutes before the time when he was due to come out, and he's been consulting with them. It's apparently what he's going to do is he's going to drive from the bungalow inside the prison compound to a point some distance short of the gates, so that he and presumably his family, maybe his supporters, will be able to actually walk out of the gates of prison after 27 years. Anyway, the news is, the expectation is
that he is coming
out in a matter of minutes.
There must be a mood of anticipation there, because these bits of news get round like wildfire in a crowd, don't they?
They do, and get distorted sometimes. But I think that's the official expectation, certainly. Though, curiously, the timing of his release is very much up to Mandela himself at this particular moment. He'll leave when he's ready.
As he's made clear all the way along. Fatima, what will the family and he have been talking about?
I don't know. I think what I'm really more interested in at the moment is to clarify this business of the British position on sanctions. I think that is vital. And if we have a few minutes, I'd like to comment on that.
We will have time for it. I'm going to ask you to pause, however, on that particular issue for a moment, while we just have a quick glance here, as we are going to stay with these pictures for a little bit longer. There is someone's going to get a good view with a bit of luck.
They must be expecting something, Jonathan. We couldn't hold that position for very long, I don't think. But obviously there's quite a buzz running around the crowd now. Everybody's sort of looking down that road. I think the bungalow is round to the right and down further down there.
Just about 3 to 4 minutes.
3 to 4 minutes walk from there?
Yeah.
No, not walk, I mean drive.
Yeah, yeah.
You just go straight down that road, Fatima, do you?
You go up that road and you turn and then you come to the bungalow. But it's 3 or 4 minutes at most.
Well, we will see then the car as it comes out from the end of that road. Of course, much has been made, Fatima, about the comfort of his conditions. Very different from what he had endured before that.
That is true.
Certainly conditions on Robben Island were very bad. I mean, for quite a long period when he first went there, he worked in a lime quarry from which you couldn't even see the sea. You could only see the sky.
All right. Well, let us then for a moment leave those pictures there. We are going to stay with those pictures, but not on BBC One.
Which gather together to form a national reception committee. That reception committee coming out with him, a whole cavalcade, coming up the road to freedom.
Now, will he be being guarded by police or just by ANC now in that cavalcade?
Well, who knows? Presumably there will be some police.
There's an extraordinary conversation going on, as if they're asking whether he has the right to leave. They're getting out of the car. Is this... Help us along, anyone who can. Fatima, if you can. If you recognise anyone, any faces you recognise, let us know.
Very dark. Our screen is very dark.
There's a flag, the ANC flag in that car.
Flying overhead, Jonathan, sort of police moving in on either side. They're very wary of any possibility that at this particular point, that he might...
Michael, we think we have a South African commentator there from the spot. So let's hear what the South African government's broadcasting organisation is saying and describing this scene.
It came to light. People scattering around, trying to get the best possible view, halfway up trees, standing on their toes, clinging to the wires, trying to see whether they can spot Mr. Nelson Mandela first. People are getting out of their cars. Movement alongside the cars, people walking in the shade, coming towards us. If we can just spot Mr. Mandela. Mr. Mandela, who has greyed, a man who has been in prison for nearly 3 decades, 72 years old, would be appearing in public for the first time any moment now. International media perched and the motorcycles start moving. And the crowd getting excited. There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa. Mrs. Winnie Mandela next to him, waving to the crowds. Hand in hand, they leave the Victor Verster prison. Officials, marshals of the National Reception Committee trying to get the people, and a salute from Mr. Nelson Mandela, his wife Winnie, greeting the people outside the fences of the Victor Verster prison. That is the man who the world has been waiting to see. His first public appearance in nearly 3 decades. 72 years old, walking strongly, step by step, further into freedom. The ANC flags. And one wonders what must be passing through Mr. Mandela's mind at this moment. The day he has also been waiting for. Excitement, people breaking through the barriers, the human barriers of the marshals who intended to keep Mr. Mandela free so that everybody could see him. An excited crowd. They've been standing in the sun the whole day, waiting for this moment. He's walking back towards the car that would probably take him to Cape Town. Maybe it is on advice of the marshals. He has been just outside the grounds of the Victor Verster prison. He's moving back. There is a very nice picture of Mr. Mandela and his wife Winnie. Moving around the car.
So there, Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela in the car that is going to speed them to Cape Town, where he is going to meet a massed rally which he will address and then give a press conference before returning later to his home in Johannesburg. The now familiar clenched fist of Winnie Mandela, surrounded. They can't actually move by the look of it at the moment because of the crowds there. Let me ask you, you've seen those images. It must be an exciting moment for you, yes?
Very exciting.
Fatima?
Very exciting. I wish the images were clearer, but he looks very good.
He's so tall and fine. He's a moral colossus. Paul, that was a pretty extraordinary sight, seeing that man come out of there completely relaxed, as if he'd come back from some trip abroad which had been successful.
Yeah.
27 years of hardship and suffering, his people oppressed with him, and there he is.
It is clearly...
I mean, he is the hope, not only for Southern Africa, but I think he's going to make an enormous contribution to the world.
The car is having some difficulty getting out of there, but it's finally beginning to get a way through. I imagine that it'll speedily go. Mendy, your thoughts at this moment?
Overwhelmed. You know, it is the Nelson I served under for a number of years in the firm of Nelson Mandela and Tambo. He's still the same man. Of course, he's never ruffled. He's always kept cool
Will he be moved by this as he drives through these crowds, or is he so cool that he expects it, is prepared for it, and is thinking to the future?
Naturally, he will be moved to find that he is coming back to that sea of welcoming arms and faces, his own people, people he hasn't been with for years.
Well, there, the South African commentator, I think, picking up the story, and we will carry on. I was just hearing then Mendy's powerful feelings as he recalled what it is like for Nelson Mandela to come out. Mendy, carry on what you were saying.
Well, I was saying, Jonathan, naturally what goes on in his mind is, what do I deliver for these people? This is what is uppermost in his mind. I want to go back to a point that was handled but as a question of unity.
There are the pictures again, Mendy, the cars are still making their slow way away from the prison, and the news will now be out across South Africa, Michael Burke, won't it? Everyone will now know. They will know in Soweto, they will know elsewhere in the country.
I'm sure, yes, that transistor radios will be operating in Soweto, and that news will have got through them already.
Let us now go and see what is happening in Soweto, if we can. Here is Soweto. We've moved across straight from Soweto. These are the images from Soweto. They've definitely heard.
Literally dancing in the streets, Jonathan, as expected. A cue for a terrific celebration that's going to go on all afternoon. It's not yet clear when Mr. Mandela will return home to Soweto. He's on his way to Cape Town, as you were saying, to address a mass rally at the City Hall.
You can be sure that they will be waiting till he comes. Let's go back again to the scene outside the prison and see how far those cars have got through the queues. There they are, disappearing. They've disappeared from sight. I think those cars there are the cars of journalists and others who've come here. I think the cars have disappeared out of sight and the people are beginning to move away. The camera crews are clearly packing up there. How long will it take him to get to Cape Town? Can anyone tell me that? Fatima, how long to Cape Town from here?
Well, if he's going to move at that pace, it'll take him a long time, but normally it takes under an hour.
Under an hour. Yeah. So we might expect that the meeting in Cape Town will start at soon after 20 past, unless, as you say, he carries on at 4 miles an hour.
Yes.
In which case they'll be waiting until tomorrow morning. I suspect that they will get up quite a good speed once they've got half a mile away from here.
That's right.
If only for security considerations again. I mean, a security nightmare there. I mean, imagine what it's going to be like over the next few days. Imagine what would happen if the security nightmare comes true.
George Walden, you're a hard, tough politician, but you have strong feelings too. What are your feelings when you see that?
Well, watching Nelson Mandela, just the way he walks, gave me the impression that this man has a sort of statesman-like bearing, and we're all going to depend a lot on that. And he's conducted himself in an extremely, cool was a word that was used, but I think highly responsible way, particularly recently with the rather fevered atmosphere. And so one feels an instinctive sense of confidence in this man. And I was very, very struck by what we heard earlier about there being an understanding between him and Mr. de Klerk.
Paddy Ashdown, you're, again, tough old politician, but there are times when one can express feelings. What are yours?
Impossible not to be deeply moved by that, a man emerging out of the darkness.
I should say that we're back now on the Soweto images. We're now back on me, as it happens. Paddy Ashdown, carry on. You were expressing your feelings about this.
Impossible not to be deeply moved about a single person. I mean, the individual person involved, let alone what now rests on him, emerging out of 30 years of darkness of prison into a position like that. I'd like to pick up the point that Mendy made, and it was touched on by George just a moment ago. I mean, the burdens that now rest on that fragile, frail, thin, old shoulders are really huge. And what rests on it, of course, is the whole question of can we unify to a single voice the black voices in South Africa, and can we manage this process of peaceful change? And in that sense, I think, to return to the point that Fatima made earlier on the question of sanctions, I think one of the most weighty considerations we must give to the question of whether or not and when we lift sanctions, I hope we shall, when conditions are right, is what will help Mr. Mandela through this very, very difficult process. And it's his and the words of his colleagues as well, their advice on this, which I think ought to weigh very, very heavily with us. And at the moment, as we understand it, they are saying it would not be helpful to him in the tremendous job that he now has to do, a job almost too big for any single human being.
The light still outside his home in Soweto, the light that will not, I'm sure, die down until he's back there. Mendy, you know that crowd, you have a sense at least of what's in their mind? The crowd that we can see in Soweto, what will the people there be expecting and hoping, and will they be over-optimistic? Is that an anxiety that you have?
Well, naturally, Jonathan, they will be. Nelson Mandela has spoken to the world behind prison bars for so long. Now he is going to be amongst them. In a way, I myself would expect him to deliver certain things. This is a leader. But Mandela...
When you say you and yourself would expect him to deliver certain things, explore that thought. What do you mean?
Well, what I mean is Mandela is coming out into a struggle that is very, very intense. He is coming out back to join his colleagues on the leadership. He is coming out to rejoin the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress. And naturally, we shall expect to see some restructuring of this organization so that it can handle the agenda that is before it now in a much more effective way.
Do you share the view that was being expressed by Paddy and George just now, that here is a frail man with an enormous burden of responsibility on his shoulders, combined with a very considerable power, and he is going to have to be a remarkable man to sustain that and to carry through in the way that he has to if there is going to be the outcome that is so widely desired?
I would share their feelings on this, but I don't know whether he is frail. He is not frail.
The picture is I'm sure he's not.
He is a strong man. I'm sure. And I think he's managed to keep his strength together throughout the years. Now, naturally, the burden that is going to be expected to carry is certainly enormous. There can be no doubt about it. He and his colleagues, he will have to depend on his colleagues. His colleagues will have to depend on him.
Let's have a look again at those images. We're in Soweto again, the continuing delight. It would be good if we could to have a glance too at those memorable shots as he came out of the jail. There he is. There's the scene again. Carry on. You were talking about the challenge that he faced, Mendy. The challenge that he faced.
Yes, so that, you know, together with his colleagues, they will certainly be expected to move things a little faster than they are now. That is a burden. And this is the burden which we are saying the international community will have to assist us with by keeping the pressures on the regime so that there is no let-up in the process.
What damage, therefore, to put the political point, which is very strongly in your minds here, what damage is there for Mandela's cause, your cause, in your view, by the British decision on sanctions, which so irritates the ANC? Given what we see there, given these extraordinary scenes of rejoicing, given the evident power and movement, the tide of history, which is so evidently now upon us, why are you so worried when Britain decides differently from most of the other nations?
Jonathan, people are happy to welcome their leader back home. A leader that has been released not because of a good-heartedness on the part of the regime, really because of the pressures that were building up inside the country as well as outside the country, the international community, which placed the question of sanctions firmly against South Africa.
And Jonathan, you shouldn't forget that those pictures we see of those people are part and parcel of the tide. And it was just such a crowd which last night the South African security police fired on. Just a crowd like we're seeing now. And the tragedy for us in Britain is that we're not going with that tide. We're saying to them, hold back, while we should be saying, we're with you. We are too committed to the destruction of apartheid, and we will do everything we can to keep the pressure on the regime so that it disintegrates, so that it recognizes the moral imperative of one person, one vote.
Those images now, again, from Soweto. We saw the replayed images of Nelson Mandela's release just before that. George Walden, this debate about Britain, clearly not a peripheral question for the leadership of the ANC, not a peripheral question for Nelson Mandela. Given this powerful, strong feeling and your own commitment to what is in Mandela's mind, do you not wish somehow that Britain did not find itself in this position of being judged to be in some way not tough enough with de Klerk, which I suppose is the appropriate way of putting the charge from the ANC position?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if we had responded in the way that you've been talking about to Gorbachev, where would that have got us? If we said, no, this man needs pressure, he doesn't need help, he needs pressure. Now, I know the analogy is not perfect, it's far from perfect, but I'm very surprised when Paul says that somehow I or my colleagues or the government is not dedicated against apartheid. That is not the case. In my own case, I happen to have been involved in the Rhodesia settlement, and I'm very proud of that involvement. And so I think it is perfectly possible to agree on aims, and aims are very simple. It must be one man, one woman, one vote, and it must be the end of apartheid, and disagree on tactics, means of getting there. And I must repeat that had the government taken the advice so liberally offered to have an all-out economic onslaught on South Africa, the risk would have been of driving that country into a lager mentality, and we may not have been watching these scenes today.
I wonder whether that's true. It's highly speculative at all events, but what I think we can certainly say is that what has brought this about is the international pressure, and it's not Mrs. Thatcher's breaking with that. In fact, Mrs. Thatcher has acted as a comfort for the South African regime. Whether she intended it to or not, I think that is the conclusion that most sane people looking at this would now draw. And it's the international pressure which has brought this about. Let me argue the case in a different way. It seems to me that Mr. de Klerk, we talk about the problems that Nelson Mandela has to carry now, but Mr. de Klerk is also in a very, very vulnerable position. It must be in his best interest to cover this no man's ground that he's now in as quickly as possible. And everything that we can do to encourage that process by pressure and by encouragement seems to me to be the right thing to do.
And that means,
if at this moment, Jonathan, if at this moment we allow the extreme right in South Africa, which you've seen some signs of it in the last two or 3 days, perhaps even through the activities of the police, if we allow them any succor in the belief that they can hold the position as it is, we will be doing this process of change no good at all, and we may even be putting Mr. de Klerk in an even more threatening position.
We're not giving succor to the extreme right. No. We're giving a gesture to de Klerk, who has brought this about, in order to encourage him to go further.
Slowing up this process in any way, or allowing it to be slowed up, will give succor and chances to the extreme right.
But de Klerk himself, in his statement, does make the admission that the international pressures against him have ruined his economy. He's feeling isolated. He needs to break out of this isolation. And we are saying it is not the time yet for de Klerk to be allowed to break out of that isolation.
We have
I'll go further.
Fatima.
And I would say that what you would encourage, you would neither be supporting de Klerk nor Mandela. You would actually be supporting the white backlash. You would be deluding them into thinking, well, now we're on our road again. Economically, we are now solvent again. We don't have to bother.
Ladies, I have to ask you to pause. politicians, experts, those of you who are committed, thank you very much for joining us here. We have started the political debate, which will now certainly rage, but I suspect that in everyone's minds who sat watching what has happened here this last hour and a quarter, there will be the memory of Mandela leaving that jail. We on BBC will be pursuing this story. The news will be covering it throughout the afternoon. The next main news on BBC One will be at 6:25, and later this evening on BBC Two at 9:30, Newsnight will bring you up to date entirely with what has happened on this momentous day. But from this special programme, from me and from all of us who took part in it, thank you for joining us. I hope you found it as exciting and important as we did. Bye-bye.
Manza in Afrika haibuye. Friends, comrades and fellow South Africans, I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy and freedom for all. I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today. I therefore place
Well, there we are. That seems to be the very first words spoken publicly by Nelson Mandela to that vast crowd. Mr. Mbeki could pick up straight away on that. He said there, I'm just a humble servant, talked about democracy and freedom for all. I come not as a prophet. Now, what do you think? What is he really getting at there, do you think?
Well, I think what he's getting at is that expectations might have been generated about his release, that he on his own individually would bring about a result such as those people who are at that square expect. That he isn't a prophet, that he would act, he would continue to act in the interests of the people, and but no miracles should be expected out of his release.
And we're now going back, indeed, to Mr. Mandela's speech.
the city to which has been my home for 3 decades. Your mass marches and other forms of struggle have served as a constant source of strength to all political prisoners. I salute the African National Congress, it has fulfilled our every expectation in its role as leader of the Great March to Freedom. I salute our President, Comrade Oliver Tambo, for leading the ANC ANC, even under the most difficult circumstances. I salute the rank and file members of the ANC. You have sacrificed life and limb in the pursuit of the noble cause of our struggle. I salute combatants of Umkhonto weSizwe.
Nelson Mandela speaking there at his rally in Cape Town, saying that he salutes the African National Congress. It has fulfilled every expectation. If we could come to Mr. Cohen in Washington. Mr. Cohen, I hope you heard that too, did you? You did. Do you think this sounds like a man who is in a mood, briefly, in a mood to make compromises?
I believe so. I've read all of his letters, all of his articles, and the statements that have been attributed to him. I think he's a man of great wisdom, and he sees that a negotiation can only lead to a good result if there are no losers, if everyone benefits, and I think he will move in that direction.
Mr. Mandela himself seems in pretty fine fettle there, doesn't he? Do you think he really himself can turn out to be a person of great significance in the process now going forward?
I would hope that his wonderful talents and wisdom will be utilized by everyone, and I think he can play a great role. Of course, there are other leaders in the movement, others who have come up after him. There are other political organizations, but he clearly has an important role to play.
Right, we'll leave it there. Mr. Cohen in Washington, thank you very much indeed. And Mr. Mbeki in London here, and Mr. Ace, thank you both for joining us on this amazing day, hearing from Mr. Mandela there. We now go to John Snow, live in Soweto.
Yes, indeed, Nick, and as you can see, there's a deal of dancing and
the party remains as strong as it always was. I salute the United Democratic Front, the National Education Crisis Committee, the South African Youth Congress, the Transvaal and Natal Indian Congresses, and COSATU, and the many other formations of the mass democratic movement. I also salute the Black Sash and the National Union of South African Students. We note with pride that you have acted as the conscience of white South Africans. Even during the darkest days in the history of our struggle, you held the flag of liberty high. The large-scale mass mobilization of the past few years is one of the key factors which led to the opening of the final chapter of our struggle. I extend my greetings to the working class of our country. Your organized strength is the pride of our movement. You remain the most dependable force in the struggle to end exploitation and oppression. I pay tribute to the many religious communities who carried the campaign for justice forward when the organizations of our people were silenced. I greet the traditional leaders of our country. Many among you continue to walk in the footsteps of great heroes like Hintsa and Sekhukhune. I pay tribute to the endless heroism of the youth. You, the young lions, have energized our entire struggle. I pay tribute to the mothers and wives and sisters of our nation. You are the rock-hard foundation of our struggle. Apartheid has inflicted more pain on you than on anyone else. On this occasion, we thank the world. We thank the world community for their great contribution to the anti-apartheid struggle. Without your support, our struggle would not have reached this advanced stage. The sacrifice of the frontline states will be remembered by South Africans forever. My salutations will be incomplete without expressing my deep appreciation for the strength given to me during my long and lonely years in prison by my beloved wife and family. I am convinced that your pain and suffering was far greater than my own. Before I go any further, I wish to make the point that I intend making only a few preliminary comments at this stage. I will make a more complete statement only after I have had the opportunity to consult with my comrades. Today, the majority of South Africans, black and white, recognize that apartheid
Nelson Mandela speaking as dusk falls across Cape Town, the very spot where the white man first came to South Africa. A speech which opened with him saying that he was dedicating the remaining days of his life and putting them in their hands. I greet you, he said, in the name of peace, democracy and freedom for all. Nelson Mandela, after more than 10,000 days in jail. We'll bring you a full report on today's events in South Africa on BBC.
Our economy lies in ruins, and our people are embroiled in political strife. Our resort to the armed struggle in 1960, with the formation of the military wing of the ANC, Umkhonto wesizwe, was a purely defensive action against the violence of apartheid. The factors which necessitated the armed struggle still exist today. We have no option but to continue. We express the hope that a climate conducive to a negotiated settlement would be created soon, so that there may no longer be the need for the armed struggle. I am a loyal and disciplined member of the African National Congress. I am therefore in full agreement with all of its objectives, strategies, and tactics. The need to unite the people of our country is as important a task now as it always has been. No individual leader is able to take on these enormous tasks on his own. It is our task as leaders to place our views before our organization and to allow the democratic structures to decide on the way forward. On the question of democratic practice, I feel duty-bound to make the point that a leader of the movement is a person who has been democratically elected at a national conference. This is a principle which must be upheld without any exception. Today, I wish to report to you that my talks with the government have been aimed at normalizing the political situation in the country. We have not as yet begun discussing the basic demands of the struggle. I wish to stress that I myself had at no time entered into negotiations about the future of our country.
Nelson Mandela speaking in Cape Town in freedom for the first time in nearly 30 years. He said that he wanted to report that his talks with the government so far had only been aimed at normalising the political situation, as he put it. I have not begun discussing the basic demands of the struggle. This came after Mr. Mandela was released from his prison. He left it at 2:15 this afternoon, walking hand in hand with his wife, Winnie Mandela, to freedom. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Tonight's media show will reflect today's events with a look at how the Afrikaans press is facing up to the prospect of dramatic political change in South Africa. That's at 8 o'clock. Art of the Western World was postponed to make way for that Channel 4 News special. It will be back next week at the usual time. It also means that our programmes are now running about 10 minutes late. Now the weather, it'll be a windy, showery night across the whole country. There'll be snow on high ground and a risk of hail and thunder. Gale force winds will affect most areas and there'll be damaging gusts in exposed places. Tomorrow, wintry showers will extend southwards, while showers in the north turn to snow on mountains, a risk of hail and thunder too. Generally, winds will ease by morning, except in the west, where gusts will reach gale force.
And outside Parliament, which can ever compare with the ANC in its total commitment to peace. And we, the armed struggle, is merely defensive. It's a defensive act against the violence of apartheid.
After 27 years of isolation, Nelson Mandela dealt with every question put to him for almost an hour, as if international news conferences had been a regular feature.
Expecting to hear Nelson Mandela. The stadium has a capacity for 50,000 people. There were many more than that here today, clinging anywhere they could for a vantage point. The crush of those coming down this funnel pressed others against the gates onto the ground. The gates were opened slightly to allow the injured to be passed over the heads of the crowd. The worst was only avoided by opening the gates completely, allowing the crowd onto the ground. But there were several injuries. And the sun took its toll during the long wait while Nelson Mandela and his advisors met in Cape Town to ponder the consequences of disappointing the people of Soweto. The spring had gone from their step as they went home disappointed, a marked contrast to the way they came this morning. The streets of Soweto had filled early. Thousands of people making their way to the Mandela House. The school children came first. It would have been impossible to fill the classrooms of Soweto today. They danced and chanted their way past the Mandela home. There was at least an indication that it's being prepared for him to take up residence again. And a short time ago, Nelson Mandela himself arrived at Johannesburg Airport, almost home at last. Edward Sturton, ITN, Soweto.
Now for the latest from Soweto, we go live to Edward Sturton. Ed, presumably there's no sign yet of Mr. Mandela there. Is there great disappointment that he hasn't turned up yet?
No, the mood has picked up again, I think, with the news that he has at least arrived in Johannesburg. There was even a rumour that he'd change his plans again and drive straight here from the airport, but he didn't do that. We understand he's gone to a house in the northern suburbs of Johannesburg and will come here tomorrow as envisaged.
What about the timetable tomorrow then? What will happen?
Tomorrow there will be a massive rally held in something called Soccer City. It's a football stadium, not the one where today's meeting was held. It's much more modern, much safer, and I believe it has room for something like 130,000 people. It'll last for between 2 and 3 hours, and after that, Nelson Mandela will finally come home to this quite modest house in the heart of Soweto.
Ed, briefly, do you think he will talk there in Soweto about peaceful negotiations?
I think that at the moment here the spirit is very much a joyful one. People aren't thinking about confrontation, and the mood is certainly conducive to the idea of peaceful negotiations. But I think at the moment people here are thinking more in terms of the happiness of this occasion than very consciously or closely about what's going to happen next.
Edward Sturton in Soweto, thank you very much. At his first news conference this morning in Cape Town, Mr. Mandela said talks with the South African government are not far away. He committed the African National Congress to peaceful change through negotiations, but also justified anti-government violence as a necessary defence against apartheid.
On his first morning as a free man, Nelson Mandela strolled with his wife Winnie in the gardens of Archbishop Tutu's residence. There were posers for the cameras, including a memorable family portrait. Grandchildren reunited with a grandfather whom they'd only known as a prisoner. Then, at the first press conference of his life, he spoke of his feelings of freedom.
I must confess I'm unable to describe my emotions. I was completely overwhelmed by the enthusiasm. It's something I did not expect.
He described, too, his impressions of the South Africa he'd seen.
It's a totally different South Africa. And along the route, I was surprised to see the number of whites who seem to identify themselves with what is happening in the country today amongst blacks.
But what of the long, long years in jail? Did he feel no bitterness?
I have lost a great deal over these 27 years. And my wife has been under all sorts of pressures. Despite the hard times that we've had in prison, you learn to get used to your circumstances. And in prison, there have been men, who are very good in the sense that they understand our point of view, and they do everything to try and make you as happy as possible. And that has wiped out any bitterness which a man could have.
Spontaneous applause concluded this historic press conference before Archbishop Tutu gave the Mandelas his blessing for the journey to Johannesburg and home.
Amen.
Amen. Kevin Dunn, ITN, Cape Town.
The first stock market trading since Mandela's release was quiet. Dealers, nervous after last week's market euphoria, are now adopting a wait-and-see attitude. The market closed slightly down. But politicians are not being so cautious. Some government ministers enjoying the world attention Mandela's release has brought them. But the right-wing opposition believes President de Klerk's actions have destabilized the country.
I'm sure that he has opened the road to a communist government in South Africa with Mr. Mandela as the president. That means black domination for us.
But does the government agree black majority rule is now inevitable?
Well, that is something that remains to be seen. But the point is that we have to do what is right for South Africa at this point in time, and that we are guided by principles and not so much by the reaction of right-wing politicians.
Some of South Africa's white campaigners have joined Mandela's supporters to celebrate, but they still say Mandela's release has not satisfied them.
Carry on the same as before, with the armed struggle, with sanctions, with organising the people. We are still walking along the same road. We are still in the same tunnel, but we can see the light at the end.
Most white voters are watching events closely, mainly pleased that Mandela is free, but nervous of what that may mean for their country. Penny Marshall, ITN, South Africa.
Here, the Foreign Office Minister William Waldegrave has told
live coverage throughout the programme.
Working class of our country.
South Africa's rebel cricket tour is cut short in the aftermath of Mandela's freedom. Soweto, the sprawling city of 2 million black South Africans. He left his home there in 1962 a hunted man, soon to be arrested and jailed. He's returned a national leader. And at this moment, Mr. Mandela is addressing 85,000 people gathered at a big soccer stadium on the outskirts of Soweto. He's appealed to them in advance to act with discipline, and so far this has been an intensely joyful and peaceful gathering. Indeed, he said that discipline and loyalty are the watchwords that will liberate South Africa.
During the most brutal periods of repression against our people, I salute the courage and the heroism of the youth of South Africa, organized under the South African Youth Congress. At this point, I wish to pay tribute to Comrade Hector Peterson, who, together with hundreds of young activists, were mowed down by apartheid bullets in 1976. We gained inspiration by your courage and conviction during our lonely years on the island.
We'll be going back to that rally in Soweto to hear more from Nelson Mandela. But first, James Robbins on the start of Nelson Mandela's homecoming.
Soccer City Stadium, Soweto. No football game in South Africa ever drew crowds like these. 48 hours after Nelson Mandela's release, finally the prospect of seeing their hero on home ground. Soweto is the unofficial capital of black South Africa, and today the capital was on the move. Everything on wheels commandeered for transport. Trucks transformed into crowds on wheels. Headline writers on Soweto's newspaper are excelling themselves. The fever has simply emptied the schools. Black children still suffering inferior apartheid education have been taught at home to honour the name Mandela. Today they can see him for themselves. Everyone arriving at the stadium is body searched. ANC marshals are determined the violence on the edges of Sunday's Cape Town rally should not be repeated here. And the searches uncovered an array of weapons at this one gate alone, symbols of a society hardened to violence. The stadium itself was filled even before Nelson Mandela left for his rally. A small crowd had discovered his secret overnight hideaway in a wealthy white suburb miles from Soweto. In the stadium, hours of entertainment to keep the crowds happy and patient. Until finally the people of Soweto could really believe in Nelson Mandela's freedom after years of hopes alternately raised by rumour and dashed in disappointment. But today only hysterical excitement.
Welcome, Comrade Mandela, welcome!
As Nelson Mandela stepped out of his car, the first sight for the people of Soweto. Raising his fist in the Black Power salute, standing tall above those seeing their leader returned. The first Soweto rally with Mandela, after the hundreds of Soweto meetings often put down by force to demand his freedom. On the platform, special greetings for the new generation of anti-apartheid campaigners who carried on the political fight all the years Nelson Mandela was in prison. Before the emotional high point of any black opposition meeting in South Africa. Nkosi Sikeleli Africa, God Bless Africa, the alternative national anthem never invested with greater meaning than it is today. The crowd believing that Nelson Mandela can displace the Afrikaners as rulers, displace their anthem, and make this the national anthem of a totally changed South Africa. James Robbins, BBC News, Soweto.
Nelson Mandela is still on his feet at the soccer stadium near Soweto. He's just over 10 minutes into his speech, a speech that he must have dreamt of making for years while in jail. And we're going over to that ceremony now.
Place in the schools. I want to add my voice, therefore, to the call made at the beginning of the year that all students must return to school and learn. We must continue our struggle for people's education within the school system and utilize its resources to achieve our goals. I call on the government to build more schools, to train and employ more teachers, and to abandon its policy of forcing our children out of the school system by use of various measures, such as the age restrictions and their refusal to admit to those who fail their classes. We have consistently called for a unitary non-racial education system that develops the potential of all our youth. As I said, when I stood on the dock at the Rivonia trial 27 years ago, and as I said on the day of my release in Cape Town, the ANC will pursue the armed struggle against the government as long as the violence of apartheid continues. Our armed combatants act under the political leadership of the ANC. Cadres of our people's army are skilled not only in military affairs, but as the political commissars of our movement. We are therefore disturbed that there are certain elements amongst those who claim to support the liberation struggle who use violence against our people. The hijacking and setting alight of vehicles and the harassment of innocent people are criminal acts that have no place in our struggle. We condemn that. Our major weapon of struggle against apartheid oppression and exploitation is our people organized into mass formation of the democratic movement. This is achieved by politically organizing our people, not through the use of violence against our people. I call in the strongest possible way for us to act with the dignity and discipline that our just struggle for freedom deserves. Our victories must be celebrated in peace and joy. In particular, I call on our people in Natal to unite against the perpetrators of violence. I call on the leadership of the UDF, COSATU, and Inkatha to take decisive steps to revive the peace initiative and the scourge on our proud history. Let us act with political foresight and develop bold steps to end the mindless violence. Joint initiatives at local, regional, and national levels between the parties concerned must call for restraint. The security forces must be compelled to act with absolute impartiality and to arrest those offenders who continue with violence. We are disturbed that attempts are being made to disrupt the unity of the oppressed by stirring tensions between African and Indian communities in Natal. Let us build on the proud tradition of unity in action as embodied in the Dadu Kuma Nika Pact, which was fully endorsed by our great hero, Chief Lutuli. I am also concerned.
Well, there we've heard from Mr. Mandela a very clear condemnation of violence. Here's our Southern Africa correspondent, James Robbins. James, what are the key points from Mr. Mandela's address so far?
Mr. Mandela has covered a huge agenda already in his speech, and he's still speaking. He's addressed particularly the issues which confront the people of Soweto, the largest of the black townships in South Africa. He started by paying tribute to all those who fought against apartheid during his time in prison. He paid tribute in particular to the many religious leaders, he said, who fought hard under the most brutal period of repression, particularly under President Berta, although he didn't mention him by name. Dealing with issues which confront the people of Soweto, he said that his heart was filled with joy returning to Soweto, but at the same time he still felt a deep sense of sadness at the housing shortage, the schools crisis, unemployment, and the crime rate, which he said was still too high. He said that he'd been greatly disturbed by the statistics of crime in Soweto, which run very high, with murders almost every day. And he said that although I recognise the level of deprivation in Soweto, I must make it clear that the level of crime in our townships is unhealthy, and it must be eliminated immediately. But he blamed the government principally for all the conditions under which black people in South Africa live, and he said that only one person, one vote on a single voter's roll could solve the problems of South Africa. In particular, he made an appeal to white people to recognise that fact, and he said that it would be necessary for black people to stretch out their hand to white people. The fears of whites, he said, in the South Africa they do not control totally, must be understood and addressed.
Africa! Africa!
He also called for a curb to violence, didn't he, James? And said that the struggle must be carried on with dignity.
He did indeed. He appealed particularly for discipline. He said that the fighting in Natal between the ANC and supporters of Chief Buthelez's Inkatha organisation particularly distressed him. And he appealed for an end to that violence, which he said diminished and endangered the struggle for freedom in South Africa.
Well, we can see there Mr. Mandela has finished his speech. and he's meeting some of the people on the podium with him.
Those of us who are inside, we will ask of you to do like the last rally, to remain...
And that's the end of the rally. I expect there'll be some more cheer.